Hello, and welcome to today's webcast. I'm Peter Cavelti, and what I'd like to talk to you about today is what matters. What matters within that information flow that comes at us every day, and what we might be able to define as less important or can even dismiss. You see, it's interesting. The average person today absorbs about 75 gigabytes of information every day. And that's the equivalent of about 16 full time movies. It's also about 6 times as much as we used to absorb in the mid 1980s, 40 years ago. Now, we also have to consider something outside the realm of information offered, and we could call it information sought. You see, 40 years ago, most information was consumed through newspapers, radio, and television. And today, the internet, smartphones, and social media create an always connected reality where information is available instantly and it's constantly updated. And I love the wording that's being used here, an always connected reality. Well, in effect, I think it's the opposite. By ever connecting to a data stream, I think we lose the ability to connect with human beings, with the environment we sit in or walk through. And, you know, if we look around ourselves, we can see that a significant part of humanity now fears that they may miss something, a call, a text, a piece of information, which pulls them away from real connection. And so, in terms of that feeling of being overwhelmed, well, even people in my age group, which is less digitally connected, find it very difficult to cope. Quite a number of people tell me, well, I'm done even looking at that because it depresses me. There is so much of it, and I can't understand it anyway without really delving into it. And so, as they report, they confine themselves typically to 10 minutes of looking at the headlines in their newspaper or tuning into their favorite television channel. And that's a treacherous way to be. Uh, all you have to ask yourself, the mainstream media, with its spin, what did it say before the Iraq war was started? It applauded it all the way. It got everything wrong. And so, you're headed for misinformation, media spin, distortion, if you go that way. And then you have the people who care, who want to come to conclusions and take responsibility. And they usually ask, well, Peter, you write about all this. How can you keep track of everything that's going on? Well, how indeed? But to begin with, I don't. I don't keep track of everything that's going on because I can't possibly process what there is to keep track of. And so a few years ago, when I felt quite overwhelmed, I developed an approach it's based on very simple principles, really. First, I ask myself what, in terms of the outside world, really matters. And I'm now talking about the world outside of my personal family or community lives, which is a different matter. I came up with four broad areas that matter immensely, in my opinion. One is the economy. I think economic well being or economic suffering has a huge impact on our existential reality. The social environment in which we are is very important. A third one that's a constant is geopolitics. And the fourth is science and technology. And so next, I asked myself, is there one or are there two or three key dynamics at work in each of these areas. And that is what I want to focus on today. What are these dynamics that I came up with? Why do they matter so much? And how will they affect uh, our personal lives, the way we perceive everything? How do they affect our family? Uh, the day which we live? How do they affect the investments we have? And so on and so forth. And it seems to me that those dynamics are surprisingly easy to identify as well. In the economic realm, government has always been, if you look back through history, recent or longer term, government has always been self-serving. Sometimes a government comes in which tries to be relatively ethical, but over time they become very self-serving. And at this point in history, we are seeing the results of that. We're once again at the point where fiscal recklessness and monetary nonsense have pushed things to the breaking point. The dynamic that's in place in the economic realm is right now the debt bubble. Because for years we've been wondering how far it can be pushed and when it'll collapse. So the debt bubble. Let's turn to the social realm. And there too, there's a prevailing dynamic that was initiated quite some time ago in the United States and is rapidly consuming the developed world. Once upon a time, you see, the United States was admired globally for its vibrant middle class and its economic opportunities. But today, US wealth and income disparity is the worst in the developed world, and is as bad as in some of the more conspicuously corrupt nations out there. And what's made it so bad is the dramatic monopolization of US industry and commerce. Now, that's an interesting part of this discussion because I've given this presentation to a couple of groups, and this is where I got the pushback. Some people said, now, wait a minute, Peter. Monopolies are great because they reflect excellence in a particular field. Well, okay, let's get one thing straight. Monopolies are not inherently evil. If a business model is really built on true entrepreneurialism and merit, well, then great. Let it prosper, let it grow, let it become big. However, if a large corporation starts to protect its turf by developing armies of lobbyists offering politicians cash for their next political campaign, uh, or offering consulting contracts or board positions once that politician re-enters the private sector, otherwise known as the revolving door, well, then it becomes an ethically challenged monopoly that serves only one purpose, which is to undermine free market principles. And my judgment would be that a major portion of America's and Europe's larger corporations today are engaged in highly unethical practices. So I stand by what I define as dynamic number two, the dynamic prevailing in the social realm, which is monopolization and the resulting contraction of the middle class and more broadly of opportunity per se. Now, let me next look at geopolitics. I think we can all agree that domestic policy platforms have become almost irrelevant as military conflicts, trade wars, so-called global initiatives such as climate change or adherence to political correctness force the national agendas. So, what's the prevalent dynamic in the political area? Well, I believe in this area there are actually two. One of them, in my opinion, is the forever war. The business model that's been pushed by the United States for decades and is still very, very strong. And then the other one is the end of the unipolar world order, which is still in its beginning. What I mean by the unipolar world order is what the United States calls the international rules-based order. In other words, the order in which the United States makes the rules. The impact of what will manifest in the geopolitical area cannot be underestimated. The major conflict brewing right now is clearly the one between Washington and Beijing, and I'll elaborate on that further. But numerous other developments, such as the ongoing Europe-Russia confrontation or the redrawing of the Middle Eastern map, could make for major trouble in the meantime as well. Okay, now what about the fourth realm? Science and technology. What dynamic do we have there? Not long ago, the focus here was on health, thanks to the COVID theatrics. And now, right now, and for the foreseeable future, I'm sure, the topic du jour is technology and its growing use of artificial intelligence, incubated and distributed through data centers that will allow the displacement of countless conventions we are used to. We have been used to for decades and decades. Now, perhaps this dynamic is the most important one because, after all, it's entirely new in every respect. You know, humanity has endured severe economic downturns, the collapse of currencies and debt pyramids. Humanity has suffered through brutal economic dislocations, long, horrible wars. And again, what's in store here is very different. And it's interesting in that context to see how the AI dynamic plays into and facilitates the other three areas we've defined. And let's look at the social context. I think the monopolization theme here is very interesting because uh, you may remember when people like Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Tim Cook, and a handful of others, uh, were facilitating Joe Biden's agendas. Or you could put it differently, were using Joe Biden's office for their own agendas, right? And those people who seemed so loyal to Democrat principles and Joe Biden were now sitting in the front row during Donald Trump's inauguration for a second term, beaming, uh, seemingly incredibly enthusiastic about the election of a leader that stood for the opposite of what Joe Biden had stood. And this just tells you what the AI community, as every other corporate community or monopoly group, is interested in, which is to own the politicians of the day. In the economic context, the monopolization of AI related technology will not only lead to domination of the information flow, but among other things, will also have devastating effects on employment and, due to several other factors, the overall economy. One key aspect is power consumption. And, we just learned a few days ago that at this time, 8 out of the defined 13 regional power markets in the United States are already at or below critical spare capacity levels. And so I can tell you what my bet is on this front. As electricity prices rise, social discontent will rise alongside. No question about that. We can also bet that AI will accelerate existing government initiatives to digitize all aspects of our lives. Now imagine a world in which the handlers of AI will determine what narratives were served up, what we should believe, and how we should act, and can then, in countless ways, monitor our behavior and enforce compliance. Scary. In the geopolitical context, consider how an AI dominated information flow can control narrative once again. After all, AI always depends wholly on the database and only on the database. So now imagine a database controlled by the United States and Western Europe. Any objectivity about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Israel's Gaza operation, or America's past proxy wars are out the window. More dangerously, the vilification of China will go on steroids. So I guess by now you can tell that the AI revolution is not on my favorites list. I'm troubled by what it does to our entrenched way of approaching a topic with the intent of coming to conclusions. And I'm talking about an individual basis, approaching a topic to come to conclusions, a process that involves our brain and is instructive and educational. In other words, look at it this way. So, if in the past we had the opportunity to walk away from a question or problem, which we were tempted to do many times, all of us, right? But then we took responsibility and confronted that problem and worked our way through it to a conclusion. Well, in my case, that always resulted in a feeling of great personal empowerment, great satisfaction. And I suspect it was the same for all of you out there as well. And now imagine an AI dominated world in which future generations are at risk of growing up without ever engaging in the thought processes that might lead to solutions of all kinds of questions or problems. It's it's amazing to me to think of that. And yet, when I see how many people out there use what's already available from AI through chatbot, GPT, and other platforms, that is what a lot of people are doing. They're depriving themselves of that journey that would be so empowering. Now, let me get to the next part of my presentation. Why do I think it's important to focus on the deeply entrenched dynamics that we've identified? Well, one reason is because it keeps us from feeling overwhelmed by the endless onslaught of narratives, media spins, political rhetoric, and so on. Just let me just use an example, okay? About I think it's no more than a month ago that the United States decided to take major equity stakes in big technology companies to the tune of tens of billions. And the United States government also said that they may do so in the future with what they call defense companies, in other words, the makers of armaments, such as Lockheed Martin, for example. And, you know, a lot of people, a lot of financial analysts I know, did a deep dive into that, did a lot of research on, well, what will that do? Okay, to me, the only question that should have mattered is this. Does the government taking these equity stakes in these companies, apart from the obvious that it creates enormous conflict of interest, but does it alter any of the key dynamics in play? No, it doesn't. In fact, it plays right into at least two of the existing themes. So you might say, are there any new events, Peter, that would change your simplified way of thinking? Well, yes, actually, there are. If a new development came across my radar that suggested that it might diminish or even counteract a dynamic that's been firmly in play, well, that would certainly cause me to engage. I would pay attention to that. And then conversely, if an event occurred that advanced the given dynamic to the breaking point, where I'd have to say, well, that dynamic is likely to implode. Well, I'd put everything else down and pay attention. As an example, if NATO put boots on the ground in Ukraine, that could be the catalyst to nuclear war. And nuclear war would usher in countless unknowns and perhaps bring to an end the dynamics I pay attention to. People ask me frequently, where is all this going next week, next month, or the term they use frequently, in the foreseeable future? Well, frankly, I do not know, and neither do you, and neither does anyone else who says they do. Uh, if they tell you they know, they're either deluded or they're very dishonest. Uh, and so, what's important here is that we know what the dynamics are and we keep focusing on them and see uh, what does not play into them and what does. And now, to finish my presentation, what I'd like to do is take a very quick and final look at each of the dynamics we've identified and ask ourselves what the investment implications are. And of course, someone might say that if we really don't know how this will play out, how can we develop a rational approach to anything? Well, I think a rational approach is to have a strategy in place. And the strategy can be as simple as we need to be nimble and careful and have some diversification. That's a lot better than not having one in place. And in my opinion, uh, that's a good start. But let's answer that question also by taking a look at each of the segments we identified. First of all, the global economy. In my opinion, the state of indebtedness and the uncertain outcome mandate a very simple principle, which is try not to own somebody else's liability. Because let's face it, we don't know if the United States and other governments will default on their debt, whether they will subject creditors to a haircut, whether they will try to inflate their way out of the current mess, or whether they'll lose complete control and the economy descends into depression. The bottom line here, in all those scenarios, I'd rather hold a stake in something real than be in possession of a paper certificate that says, I owe you so much and I promise to repay it. Okay? To me, that is a very important principle. And when we look at that context, what looks particularly good here in terms of things that we can take a stake in, I will delve more deeply into it and look at other possibilities and opportunities. But one thing that looms large right away is gold, because predictions of a nearby high that we've heard here and there, oh, gold can't go higher, it's gone up so much, are completely at odds with the current fiscal and monetary backdrops. Because all we need to do is ask ourselves, after the last huge rally in gold through the 1970s, uh, what caused gold to top out? Well, what it was that the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, and some foreign central banks, like the Bank of Canada, said inflation is way too high. We're going to raise interest rates dramatically until we've broken inflation's back. Okay? Well, right now, we're at the opposite end of the curve. Where we are now kind of reminds me of the mid 70s, where the government was uh, pushing very hard for central banks to lower interest rates, and the central banks did so even in the face of persistent inflation. And that's where we're right now. And that got us in the price of gold from back then from about $100 an ounce to $852 an ounce. So gold looks very good here, in my opinion. The other thing that I would say that's also very important at times of great uncertainty, just as now, whatever asset category you're in, whatever investment you target, liquidity is very, very important. And so, right off the bat, I would say things like private credit, private equity, which are notoriously illiquid, I would be cautious of. Uh, Highly liquid things. So that means a corporation has to have good liquidity, serious market capitalization, so that you can liquidate your investment if things don't go well or if you change your mind. Okay, social developments. How will they affect your investments? The problem with the dynamic here, the creation of a de facto oligarchy and the concurrent impoverishment of the middle and lower classes makes for kind of a grim scenario for the investment scene overall, particularly in light of the huge retail presence in the equity space, particularly in the United States. I think we're very likely to move from that straight line trajectory that we've seen during the past years to one of much more volatility. And, in that context, you already know I'm not a friend of bonds. And in the stock market, for that same reason, I would stick to companies that have a clean balance sheet and a robust, sustainable cash flow, and ideally also pay a dividend. But the key one is the clean balance sheet, fiscal responsibility. What about geopolitical factors? Well, this, in my opinion, is the most difficult area in that timing and scope of engagement and outcomes are very, very elusive. So right now we know that clearly the United States is distancing itself from its Russia focus of pretty well the post-war era, leaving the mess to its tough talking and frightfully weak and divided European allies. And clearly, Washington wants more room to ramp up its hostility versus China, toward China. And the same can be said of Washington's Asian would-be partners. Japan just a couple of weeks ago announced it may participate in a China-Taiwan military conflict. And it's now building up its missile ability in the islands it owns that are relatively close to Taiwan. And then 2 days later, after the Japanese Prime Minister's revelation, South Korea announced that it had secured an agreement with the United States to build nuclear-powered attack submarines. So that is kind of alarming, but we don't know when and what the coming confrontations are. And, we don't know a lot of things, but it's important to keep an eye on that whole dynamic of the forever war. And also, the United States has, in terms of State Department doctrine, repeatedly stated that the uh, upcoming uh, that the dynamic of a rival, uh, militarily, economically, and so on, is not acceptable to the United States. And China clearly is a huge rival to the United States and will become a bigger rival. We should also take seriously the advantages that technology brings to this area. Relatively simple technology will affect battle methods, military know-how in a dramatic way. And I would say that asymmetrical warfare will find many new manifestations in the coming years. Just think of the effective use of relatively cheap drones by Yemen's Houthis and the damage they can do. Or what happened in Lebanon when the Israelis equipped people with smartphones that have been doctored to contain explosives. Now, I would not be surprised at all if attacks on internet platforms and electrical grids became the next frontier. I've been told by many that no, that will never ever happen because it would affect China and Russia as the would be perpetrators just as deeply as it would affect America and Europe. Well, my response to that is yeah, of course. In war, everyone loses, but the party who loses least wins. And the fact is that if you look at those two, China and Russia, well, their government has far greater control over their population than the US or European governments do. Just imagine downing of the internet for 4 or 5 days, and concurrently the electrical grid is impacted too. Imagine that emergency in the context of Paris or London or Chicago. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Because you have a deeply divided population, a very restless population. And then, of course, in the United States, you have the added disadvantage that a significant number of citizens own guns, while a huge number of others don't. So that doesn't make for a pretty picture. So I think we should take that possibility seriously. Now, what that all means for financial markets obviously depends again on timing, on location, on severity. But we can still do some basic research and come to some conclusions. Let's look at Europe first. And I'm talking again about investment implications. Europe has had a year where stocks have had a remarkable run. And yet, it's one region I definitely shy away from. And why is that? Well, it's not only because the continent's key economies are in terrible shape. Just look at Germany, Britain, France. Horrific economic damage has been done and continues. It's not only because Trump's tariff uncertainties are affecting Europe more negatively than they affect the United States, but it's also because of Europe itself, because tensions within the European Union are clearly rising, and the threat of a military confrontation with Russia could plunge Europe uh, deeply, deeply into trouble and cause huge socioeconomic harm. So, when you look at things top down globally, yes, the United States swims in very dangerous waters, but in my opinion, most of Europe is in worse shape. So, in other words, from an absolutist viewpoint, the US looks like a train wreck. But from a relativist perspective, it's far less bad in the United States than elsewhere. What do I think about the emerging markets? That's a key question. Because after all, uh, the end of the unipolar world order is a big part of the geopolitical scenery. It's one of the two prevailing dynamics. I want to stress that I take the expansion of the BRICS bloc and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization bloc very seriously. I think America's ever more frequent and desperate impositions of sanctions will necessarily encourage others to cut back on using the dollar as a trade settlement medium and using US controlled banking and payment systems. Just look at what happened to the people who had uh, sanctions imposed upon them. I mean, we're looking at Russian uh, central bank assets that were held by other major nations and they're now frozen. So everybody out there in the non transatlantic partnership uh, nations, plus Japan, plus South Korea, plus the Down Unders, Australia, New Zealand, everybody outside of that system is looking to distance themselves from the United States. And yet, despite that dynamic, which I expect not only to continue but to deepen, I've never embraced the narrative that a dollar collapse is absolutely imminent. And just think of that has been the mainstream viewpoint now for 3 years. Financial analysts have predicted the dollar will collapse any moment. Well, why am I not on board with that? To begin with, when the meetings between the BRICS nations or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization take place, we always get these lovely reportages and compelling images of solidarity. But the fact is that a whole bunch of members from Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Egypt or Indonesia, and far more importantly, big economies like India and Brazil continued to play both sides. Because that's, after all, what sovereign nations do. They are highly transactional in their approach on the foreign policy front. And meanwhile, global capital flows follow the principle of relativism, and interest rates play a major role too. Right now, policy rates on the dollar are far more attractive than those abroad. Now, once that changes, I will reconsider. It's quite possible that at the beginning of next year, the Federal Reserve will actually lower interest rates in a meaningful way if we get some economic pain. And if that happens, I think the dollar is going to take another leg down and I will jump ship. Again, what will benefit most from all this? Well, I think gold will be a major beneficiary. I expect more dumping and of United States and European Union bonds from central banks in the emerging economies, particularly. I also expect more hedging against uncertainty from private and institutional investors, and there will be a lot more need for portfolio stabilization. Now, I think it's important that gold has the right percentage within an overall portfolio. My choice has always been 15%. I wouldn't particularly go below that ever, but I also would not go with 20 or 30% because uh, it's a volatile environment in which we are, and things may need to be reconsidered from time to time. So we've got 15%, and we constantly adjust that to the same 15%. So if gold goes up and it's suddenly 16, 17% of your overall assets, We cut it down to 15 again, and vice versa. If we get a sell-off, suddenly it's only 14% of overall assets. We ramp it up back to 15. How, finally, will the AI revolution affect the investment scene? And here we will come to a number of insights that also will affect your portfolio choices. We've seen record amounts of capital flow into big tech to the point where 10 companies make up over 40% of the S&P 500. Now, that's an index that by definition is composed of large enterprises. So just think about this. 10 stocks out of 500 account for more than 40% of the market capitalization of those 500. I would say that given what we know about the massive capital investments big tech is deploying to AI data centers and how little we know about the timelines toward hopefully profitability, and how absurdly these companies are valued, I would stay away from them. I wouldn't short them, but I would definitely stay away from them. Instead, I deploy investment capital to companies that'll benefit from the AI boom, specifically in the building of data centers. What are those? Well, at the forefront are the mining companies which have a robust production profile in the conducting metals, such as copper and silver, because it's all about electricity, and electrical conduction is very, very prominent, is needed, and copper and silver are not in oversupply at all. I'd also look at utilities in key strategic areas. They come to mind as well. And then there is uranium, a big one, which will be the key to power generation more and more, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and very much so in China. So uranium is on my list as well. And in time, the currently out of favor energy sector, in other words, conventional oil and gas, should benefit. So when we look overall, we can conclude that the stock market is challenged. The stock market in many areas is overvalued. The broad economic potential doesn't favor further rises in price, but there are highly interesting pockets of sectors of the stock market, which I've just identified. And remarkably, they're not in valuation stretch territory. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope I've helped you focus on what matters a lot and what is just noise and media spin. And, you know, maybe if you struggle with feeling overwhelmed, my approach has helped a bit too. But please feel free to share this webcast with your friends. And remember, you can always access our research on our website, www.cavelty.com, where you can sign up and your friends can sign up as well for our free monthly updates. And I definitely encourage you to do that because it gives you a continued overview of not just the world we live in, but also the investment implications. And with that, thank you for dialing in. And this is probably my last webcast for 2025. I may have another strategic update coming out soon, but my last webcast. So happy holidays to all of you. Take care.